Welcome back, everybody. We are in Unit 1 still. In our last video, we looked at the age of absolutism. We found out what an absolute monarch was, and today we're going to apply that concept to two big events in English history. The first is the English Civil War, and then something called the Glorious Revolution. Now, our objective for this lesson is that you should be able to describe the causes and effects of the English Civil War. So, causes and effects. And we're going to begin with an event from over 800 years ago. It involves a document called the Magna Carta. So our first main idea says Magna Carta limited the power of English kings for the first time. So let's try to figure out what that did. Now, if you think about America, we know we have one document that sort of is the bedrock of our government. And that document, of course, is the Constitution. And our Constitution draws on at least some of the ideas found in this document we're going to look at here in a moment, called the Magna Carta. Now, its origins go back to the year 1215. So again, over 800 years ago. And in England, there's a group of advisors and nobles and well-to-do people back then anyways, called the Parliament. And the Parliament saw themselves as kind of counterweight to the King of England. And in 1215, they rose up against their king, King John, for several reasons, but to keep it simple, basically he had raised taxes to fight wars that were not going well, and the nobility were fed up. And so they rise up, they corner King John, and they force him to sign this document called the Magna Carta. Now, the Magna Carta means, in English, the Great Charter, and a charter is an agreement between two groups. So, to put it very simply, what the Magna Carta did was that for the first time in history, at least English history, the power of the monarchy, the power of the King of England was limited by law. Now, originally, these rights only applied to the nobility, to the wealthy people of England, in other words, but over time, those rights have been extended outward to all English citizens. So this is a landmark moment in English history because it really does point the direction to some sort of self-government, that the people themselves have rights that the king and the monarchy has to respect. So, let's think about this. How are the kings and queens of England going to feel about the Magna Carta? And then, well, what could they do about these feelings? Let's look at main idea number 2. Charles I's loss in the English Civil War further limited the power of English kings. Let's get into the English Civil War now. So we're going to jump from 1215 all the way up to 1642. And by 1642, England is being ruled by an absolute monarch named Charles I. You can see Charles I there. And like King John back in 1215, King Charles I is going to find himself facing a rebellion largely from the nobility. And once again, it has to do with taxes and rights that the monarchy was not respecting of its people. Now, in this civil war, the opposition, who were supporters of Parliament, they called themselves the Roundheads, and the Roundheads eventually won this civil war largely because of the military prowess of a guy named Oliver Cromwell. This is Oliver Cromwell on the left there in his armor. Now, if you're Oliver Cromwell, you've just won the English Civil War, you've defeated Charles I, what do you do with him? That's the big question. What do you do with Charles I? Well, it was decided to put Charles on trial, and Charles I was put on trial, found guilty, and sentenced to death. They executed their king, and England then transitioned from being a monarchy to a republic. In this period in English history, while England was a republic, is known as the Commonwealth. And there's the crowd gathered to witness the execution of their king, King Charles I. There's Oliver Cromwell looking at Charles I. Well, the Republic or Commonwealth only lasts about as long as Oliver Cromwell did. Turned out that he was a bit of an absolute ruler himself. Even though he wasn't a king per se, he ruled kind of like one, and there was a lot of resentment against the establishment, the Republic of England. So when he died, the Commonwealth began to fall apart. Now, with Cromwell gone and the Commonwealth unpopular, we have to think, okay, what would happen next in England? And that brings us to something called the Restoration. So think about what restoration means. What does it mean to restore something? Think about your phone. What if your phone was all kinds of messed up and they couldn't fix it? They might have to restore it to its original settings, right? They would have to basically wipe it clean and start fresh. And that's what's going to happen with England. The monarchy is going to return to England after something called the Restoration. So let's get some background on this. In 1660, the Parliament, which is still out there, basically said, hey, Charles II, now this is the son of Charles I, the guy they had executed. They asked him, would you like to return from exile? Would you like to come home to England and become King of England? And he agreed. And so the monarchy is restored once Charles II is brought back. Now, Charles II dies and his brother takes over, James II. So James II and Charles II were both sons of Charles I, the English king that was killed after the English Civil War. Now, the difference with James II is he was a Catholic, and he turned out to be kind of a throwback to the days of absolute monarchy. Now, why is it a big deal that he's a Catholic? Well, going back to Henry VIII, the English had broken with the Catholic Church, and it was, in many cases, illegal to even practice Catholicism, and a lot of people felt that James II might bring back Catholicism to England. And fearing that, something has to be done. Other examples of James II's absolute monarchy, he began to suspend laws that he didn't like. So in other words, kind of overriding the Parliament. He begins putting Catholics into high office, and people fear that this is kind of a slippery slope, and before you know it, this guy is going to be an absolute Catholic monarch, and Catholicism will be forced down our throats here in England. So the question is, what can Parliament do about this? And that brings us to our final big event. It's called the Glorious Revolution. So main idea number 4, the Glorious Revolution and the English Bill of Rights both limited the power of English kings. So in 1688, Parliament reaches out to James II's daughter. Her name's Mary. She was living in the Netherlands at the time, married to a Dutch guy named William of Orange. So the Parliament says, listen, your dad is out of control. We've got to get rid of him. Would you like to replace him? So Mary and William agree to overthrow James II. And faced with a potential, it was an invasion, and faced with the potential of being defeated and perhaps killed like his father, James II decides to not even fight. He basically just surrenders and flees in the face of this invasion. And this is what we call the Glorious Revolution. The reason it's glorious is that it was bloodless. No one had to die in order to see a transition of power, to see a king being overthrown and replaced by another one. So let's think about everything we've covered so far, whether it was the Magna Carta, whether it was the English Civil War, Glorious Revolution, whatever it is, who is stronger at this point, Parliament or the monarchy? And the answer, of course, is the Parliament. Now, when William and Mary agreed to become King and Queen of England, there were some details, there were some fine print, there were some restrictions. And we collectively know these as the English Bill of Rights, which was passed in 1689 and that William and Mary agreed to. So much like we have a Bill of Rights, so do the English. In fact, theirs predates ours by almost a century. And just a couple of high points here of the English Bill of Rights. Going forward, kings or queens could not suspend Parliament's laws. In other words, they couldn't veto what Parliament had said or what wanted to do. They couldn't put taxes on the people. That means to levy. You can't levy taxes without Parliament's approval. So if you're going to tax, Parliament has to agree first. You couldn't interfere in what Parliament is doing. You can't interfere with the freedom of speech. They have a right to talk openly and debate in Parliament, and you as king can't punish them for doing that. Also, you can't penalize a citizen who's petitioning the king about grievances. So if you have a complaint and you send a letter to the king saying, I think we need to fix this or this isn't good, you can't be punished for that. All right, so let's quickly review. We talked about the causes and effects of the English Civil War in this lesson. We looked at the Magna Carta. We looked at some reasons why the English Civil War happened. We looked at the Commonwealth that came out of the English Civil War. And then we also looked at the Glorious Revolution at the end with the English Bill of Rights. So a lot of ground to cover, but the key takeaway here is that in England, absolute monarchy will have great limits. It's not an absolute monarchy. Even hundreds of years ago it wasn't. It certainly isn't today.